Chapter 6 of the Grammar of Assent by John Henry Newman. St. John Henry Newman. Assent considered as unconditional. I have now said as much as need be said about the relation of assent to apprehension, and shall turn to the consideration of the relation existing between assent and inference. As apprehension is a concomitant, so inference is ordinarily the antecedent of assent. On this surely I need not enlarge, but neither apprehension nor inference interferes with the unconditional character of the assent viewed in itself. The circumstances of an act, however necessary to it, do not enter into the act. Assent is in its nature absolute and unconditional, though it cannot be given except under certain conditions. This is obvious, but what presents some difficulty is this: how it is that a conditional acceptance of a proposition, such as is an act of inference, is able to lead as it does to an unconditional acceptance of it, such as is assent. How it is that a proposition which is not and cannot be demonstrated, which at the highest can only be proved to be truth-like, not true, such as I shall die, nevertheless claims and receives our unqualified adhesion to the consideration of this paradox, as it may be called. I shall now proceed, that is, to the consideration, first of the act of assent to a proposition, which act is unconditional, next to the act of inference, which goes before the assent and is conditional, and thirdly of the solution of the apparent inconsistency which is involved in holding that an unconditional acceptance of a proposition can be the result of its conditional verification. Simple assent. Heading 1. Simple assent. The doctrine which I have been enunciating requires such careful explanation that it is not wonderful that writers of great ability and name are to be found who have put it aside in favor of a doctrine of their own. But no doctrine on the subject is without its difficulties, and certainly not theirs, though it carries with it a show of common sense. The authors to whom I refer wish to maintain that there are degrees of assent, and that, as the reasons for a proposition are strong or weak, so is the assent. It follows from this that absolute assent has no legitimate exercise, except as ratifying acts of intuition or demonstration. What is thus brought home to us is indeed to be accepted unconditionally, but as to reasonings in concrete matters, they are never more than probabilities, and the probability in each conclusion which we draw is the measure of our assent to that conclusion. Thus assent becomes a sort of necessary shadow following upon inference, which is the substance and is never without some alloy of doubt, because inference in the concrete never reaches more than probability. Such is what may be called the a priori method of regarding assent in its relation to inference. It condemns an unconditional assent in concrete matters on what may be called the nature of the case. Assent cannot rise higher than its source. Inference in such matters is at best conditional. Therefore assent is conditional also. Abstract argument is always dangerous, and this instance is no exception to the rule. I prefer to go by facts. The theory to which I have referred cannot be carried out in practice. It might be rightly said to prove too much, for it debars us from unconditional assent in cases in which the common voice of mankind, the advocates of this theory included, would protest against the prohibition. There are many truths in concrete matter which no one can demonstrate, yet everyone who unconditionally accepts, and though of course there are innumerable propositions to which it would be absurd to give an absolute assent, still the absurdity lies in the circumstances of each particular case, as it is taken by itself, not in their common violation of the pretentious axiom that probable reasoning can never lead to certitude. Locke's remarks on the subject are an illustration of what I have been saying. This celebrated writer, after the manner of his school, speaks freely of degrees of assent, and considers that the strength of assent given to each proposition varies with the strength of the inference on which the assent follows. Yet he is obliged to make exceptions to his general principle, exceptions unintelligible on his abstract doctrine, but demanded by the logic of facts. The practice of mankind is too strong for the antecedent theorem to which he is desirous to subject it. First, he says, in his chapter on probability, most of the propositions we think, reason, discourse, nay, act upon, are such as we cannot have undoubted knowledge of their truth, yet some of them border so near upon certainty that we make no doubt at all about them, but assent to them as firmly, and act according to that assent as resolutely as if they were infallibly demonstrated, and that our knowledge of them was perfect and certain. Here he allows that inferences which are only near upon certainty are so near that we legitimately accept them with no doubt at all, and assent to them as firmly as if they were infallibly demonstrated. That is, he affirms this and sanctions the very paradox to which I am committed myself. Again, he says in his chapter on the degrees of assent, that when any particular thing consonant to the constant observation of ourselves and others in the like case comes attested by the concurrent reports of all that mention it, we receive it as easily and build as firmly upon it as if it were certain knowledge, and we reason and act thereupon with as little doubt as if it were perfect demonstration. End quote. And he repeats, quote, these probabilities rise so near to certainty that they govern our thoughts as absolutely and influence all our actions as fully as the most evident demonstration, and in what concerns us we make little or no difference between them and certain knowledge. Our belief thus grounded rises to assurance. End quote. Here again, probabilities may be so strong as to govern our thoughts as absolutely as a sheer demonstration, so strong that belief, grounded on them, rises to assurance. This is to certitude. I have so high a respect for both the character and the ability of Locke, for his manly simplicity of mind, and his outspoken candor, and there is so much in his remark upon reasoning and proof in which I fully concur, that I feel no pleasure in considering him in the light of an opponent to views which I myself have ever cherished as true, with an obstinate devotion. And I would willingly think that in the passage which follows in his chapter on enthusiasm, he is aiming at superstitious extravagancies which I should repudiate myself as much as he can do. But if so, his words go beyond the occasion and contradict what I have quoted from him above. He that would seriously set upon the search of truth ought in the first place to prepare his mind with a love of it, for he that loves it will not take much pains to get it. For he that loves it not will not take much pains to get it, nor be much concerned when he misses it. There is nobody in the commonwealth of learning who does not profess himself a lover of the truth, and there is not a rational creature that would not take it amiss to be thought otherwise of. And yet, for all this, one may say truly that there are very few lovers of truth, for truth's sake, even amongst those who persuade themselves that they are so. How a man may know whether he be so in earnest is worth inquiry, and I think there is this one unerring mark of it, viz., the not entertaining any proposition with greater assurance than the proofs it is built upon will warrant. Whoever goes beyond this measure of assent, it is plain, receives not the truth in the love of it, loves not truth for truth's sake, but for some other by-end. For the evidence that any proposition is true, except such as are self-evident, lying only in the proofs as man has of it, whatsoever degree of assent he affords it beyond the degrees of that evidence, it is plain all that surplusage of assurance is owing to some other affection, and not to the love of truth, it being as impossible that the love of truth should carry my assent above the evidence there is to me, that it is true, as that the love of truth should make me assent to any proposition for the sake of that evidence which it has not, that it is true, which is in effect to love it as a truth, because it is possible or probable that it may not be true. Here he says that it is not only illogical but immoral to carry our assent above the evidence that a proposition is true, to have a surplusage of assurance beyond the degrees of that evidence, and he accepts from this rule only self-evident propositions. How, then, is it not inconsistent with right reason, with the love of truth for its own sake, to allow in his words quoted above certain strong probabilities to govern our thoughts as absolutely as the most evident demonstration? How is there no surplusage of assurance beyond the degrees of evidence, when in the case of those strong probabilities we permit our belief thus grounded to rise to assurance, as he pronounces we are rational in doing? Of course, he had in view one set of instances when he implied that demonstration was the condition of absolute assent, and another set when he said that it was no such condition. But he surely cannot be acquitted of slovenly thinking in thus treating a cardinal subject. A philosopher should so anticipate the application and guard the enunciation of his principles as to secure them against the risk of their being made to change places with each other, to defend what he is eager to denounce, and to condemn what he finds it necessary to sanction. However, whatever is to be thought of his a priori method and his logical consistency, his animus, I fear, must be understood as hostile to the doctrine which I am going to maintain. He takes a view of the human mind in relation to inference and assent, which to me seems theoretical and unreal. Reasonings and convictions which I deem natural and legitimate, he apparently would call irrational, enthusiastic, perverse, and immoral, and that, as I think, because he consults his own ideal of how the mind ought to act, instead of interrogating human nature as an existing thing, as it is found in the world, instead of going by the testimony of psychological facts, and thereby determining our constitutive faculties and our proper condition, and being content with the mind as God has made it. He would form men as he thinks they ought to be formed, and some to something better and higher, and calls them irrational and indefensible, if, so to speak, they take to the water, instead of remaining under the narrow wings of his own arbitrary theory. Now, the first question which this theory leads me to consider is whether there is such an act of the mind as assent at all. If there is, it is plain it ought to show itself unequivocally as such, as distinct from other facts. For if a professed act can only be viewed in the necessary and immediate repetition of another act, if assent is a sort of reproduction and double of an act of inference, if, when inference determines that a proposition is somewhat or not, a little or a good deal or very like truth, then I do not see what we mean by saying, or why we say at all, that there is any such act. It is simply superfluous in a psychological point of view, and a curiosity for subtle minds, and the sooner it is got out of the way, the better. When I assent, I am supposed, it seems, to do precisely what I do when I infer, or rather not quite so much, but something which is included in inferring. For a while, the disposition of my mind towards a given proposition is identical in assent, and in inference I merely drop the thought of the premises when I assent, thought not of their influence on the proposition inferred, though not of their influence on the proposition inferred. This, then, and no more, after all, is what nature prescribes, and this, and no more than this, is the conscientious use of our faculties. So to assent, forsooth, as to do nothing else than infer. Then, I say, if this be really the state of the case, if assent in no real way differs from inference, it is one and the same thing with it. It is another name for inference, and to speak of it at all does but mislead. Nor can it fairly be urged as a parallel case that an act of conscious recognition, though distinct from an act of knowledge, is, after all, only its repetition. On the contrary, such a recognition is a reflex act with its own object, viz., the act of knowledge itself. As well might be said that the hearing of the notes of my voice is a repetition of the act of singing. It gives no plausibility, then, to the anomaly I am combating. I lay it down, then, as a principle that either assent is intrinsically distinct from inference, or the sooner we get rid of the word in philosophy, the better. If it be only the echo of an inference, do not treat it as a substantive act, but on the other hand, supposing it be not such an idle repetition, as I am sure it is not, supposing the word assent does hold a rightful place in the language and in thought, if it does not admit of being confused with concluding and inferring, if the two words are used for two operations of the intellect which cannot change their character, if in matter of fact they are not always found together, if they do not vary with each other, if one is sometimes found without the other, if one is strong when the other is weak, if sometimes they seem even in conflict with each other, then since we know perfectly well what an inference is, it comes upon us to consider what, as distinct from inference, an assent is. And we are, by the very fact of its being distinct, advanced one step towards that account of it which I think is the true one. The first step, then, towards deciding the point will be to inquire what the experience of human life, as it is daily brought before us, teaches us of the relation to each other of inference and assent. 1. First, we know from experience that assents may endure without the presence of the inferential acts upon which they were originally elicited. It is plain that as life goes on, we are not only inwardly formed and changed by the accession of habits, but we are also enriched by a great multitude of beliefs and opinions, and that on a variety of subjects. But these beliefs and opinions, held as some of them are almost as first principles, are assents, and they constitute, as it were, the clothing and furniture of the mind. I have already spoken of them under the head of credence and opinion. Sometimes we are fully conscious of them, sometimes they are implicit, or only now and then come directly before our reflective faculty. Since still they are assents, and when we first admitted them, we had some kind of reason, slight or strong, recognized or not, for doing so. However, whatever those reasons were, even if we ever realized them, we have long forgotten them. Whether it was the authority of others, or our own observation, or our reading, or our reflections, which became the warrant of our assent, anyhow, we received the matters in question into our minds as true, and gave them a place there. We assented to them, and we still assent, though we have forgotten what the warrant was. At present they are self-sustained in our minds, and have been so for long years. They are in no sense conclusions, they imply no process of thought. Here, then, is a case in which assent stands out as distinct from inference. 2. Again, sometimes assent fails, when the reasons for it and the inferential act, which is the recognition of those reasons, are still present and in force. Our reasons may seem to us as strong as ever, yet they do not secure our assent. Our beliefs founded on them were and are not. We cannot perhaps tell when they went. We may have thought that we still held them till something happened to call our attention to the state of our minds, and then we found that our assent had become an assertion. Sometimes, of course, a cause may be found why they went. There may have been some vague feeling that a fault lay in the ultimate basis, or in the underlying conditions of our reasonings, or some misgiving that the subject matter of them was beyond the reach of the human mind, or a consciousness that we had gained a broader view of things in general than when we first gave our assent, or that there were strong objections to our first convictions, which we had never taken into account. But this is not always so. Sometimes our mind changes so quickly, so unaccountably, so disproportionately to any tangible arguments to which the change can be referred, and with such abiding recognition of the force of the old arguments, as to suggest the suspicion that moral causes arising out of our condition, age, company, occupations, fortunes, are at the bottom. However, what once was assent is gone, yet the perception of the old arguments remains, showing that inference is one thing and assent another. 3. As assent sometimes dies out without tangible reasons sufficient to account for its failure, so sometimes, in spite of strong and convincing arguments, it is never given. We sometimes find men loud in their admiration of truths which they never profess. As by the law of our mental constitution, obedience is quite distinct from faith, and men may believe without practicing. So is assent also independent of our acts of inference? Again, prejudice hinders assent to the most incontrovertible proofs. Again, it not unfrequently happens that while the keenness of the ratiocinative faculty enables a man to see the ultimate results of a complicated problem in a moment, it takes years for him to embrace it as a truth and to recognize it as an item in the circle of his knowledge. Yet he does at least so accept it, and then we say that he assents. 4. Again, very numerous are the cases in which good arguments, and really good as far as they go, and confessed by us to be good, very numerous are the cases in which good arguments, and really good as far as they go, and confessed by us to be good, nevertheless are not strong enough to incline our minds ever so little to the conclusion at which they point. But why is it that we do not assent a little in proportion to those arguments? On the contrary, we throw the full onus probandi on the side of the conclusion, and we refuse to assent it at all until we can assent to it altogether. The proof is capable of growth, but the assent either exists or does not exist. 5. I have already alluded to the influence of moral motives in hindering assent to conclusions which are logically unimpeachable. According to the couplet, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Assent, then, is not the same as inference. 6. Strange as it may seem, this contrast between inference and assent is exemplified even in the province of mathematics. Argument is not always able to command our assent, even though it be demonstrative. Sometimes, of course, it forces its way, that is, when the steps of the reasoning are few, and admit of being viewed by the mind altogether. Certainly one cannot conceive a man having before him the series of conditions and truths on which it depends that the three angles of a triangle are altogether equal to two right angles, and yet not assenting to that proposition. Were all propositions as plain, though assent would not be in consequence. Were all propositions as plain, though assent would not be in consequence be the same act as inference, yet it would certainly follow immediately upon it. I allow then as much as this, that when an argument is in itself and by itself conclusive of a truth, it has, by a law of our nature, the same command over our assent, or rather the truth which it has reached has the same command, as our senses have. Certainly our intellectual nature is under laws, and the correlative of ascertained truth is unreserved assent. But I am not speaking of short and lucid demonstrations, but of long and intricate mathematical investigations, and in that case, though every step may be indisputable, it still requires a specially sustained attention and an effort of memory to have in the mind all at once all the steps of the proof with their bearings on each other, and the antecedents which they severally involve. And these conditions of the inference may interfere with the promptness of our assent. Hence it is that party spirit or national feeling or religious prepossessions have before now had power to retard the reception of truths of a mathematical character, which never could have been if demonstrations were ipso facto assents. Nor indeed would any mathematician, even in questions of pure science, assent to his own conclusions on new and difficult ground, and in the case of abstruse calculations, however often he went over his work, till he had the corroboration of other judgments besides his own. He would have carefully revised his inference, and would assent to the probability of his accuracy in inferring, but still he would abstain from an immediate assent to the truth of his conclusion. Yet the corroboration of others cannot add to his perception of the proof. He would still perceive the proof, even though he failed in gaining their corroboration. And yet again he might arbitrarily make it his rule never to assent to his conclusions without such corroboration, or at least before the lapse of a sufficient interval. Here again inference is distinct from assent. I have been showing that inference and assent are distinct acts of the mind, and that they may be made apart from each other. Of course, I cannot be taken to mean that there is no legitimate or actual connection between them, as if arguments adverse to a conclusion did not naturally hinder assent, or as if the inclination to give assent were not greater or less according as the particular act of inference expressed a stronger or weaker probability, or as if assent did not always imply grounds and reason implicit, if not explicit, or could be rightly given without sufficient grounds. So much is it commonly felt that assent must be preceded by inferential acts, that obstinate men give their own will as their very reason for assenting, if they can think of nothing better. Stat pro ratione voluntas. Indeed, I doubt whether assent is ever given without some preliminary, which stands for a reason. But it does not follow from this, that it may not be withheld in cases when there are good reasons for giving it to a proposition, or may not be withdrawn after it has been given. The reasons remaining or may not the reasons remaining, or may not remain when the reasons are forgotten, or must always vary in strength as the reasons vary. And this substantiveness, as I may call it, of the act of assent is the very point which I have wished to establish. And in showing that assent is distinct from an act of inference, I have gone a good way towards showing in what it differs from it. If assent and inference are each of them the acceptance of a proposition, but the special characteristic of their inference is that it is conditional, it is natural to suppose that assent is unconditional. Yet, again, if assent is the acceptance of truth, and truth is the proper object of the intellect, and no one can hold conditionally what by the same act he holds to be true, here too is a reason for saying that assent is an adhesion without reserve or doubt to the proposition to which it is given. And again, it is to be presumed that the word has not two meanings. What it has at one time, it has at another. Inference is always inference, even if demonstrative. It is still conditional. It establishes an incontrovertible conclusion on the condition of incontrovertible premises. To the conclusion thus drawn, assent gives its absolute recognition. In the cases of all demonstrations, assent, when given, is unconditionally given. In one class of subjects, then, assent is always unconditional. But if the word stands for an undoubting and unhesitating act of the mind once, why does it not denote the same always? What evidence is there that it ever means anything else than that which the whole world will unite in witnessing that it means in certain cases? Why are we not to interpret what is controverted by what is known? This is what is suggested on the first view of the question, but to continue. In demonstrative matters, assent excludes the presence of doubt. Now are instances producible, on the other hand, of its ever coexisting with doubt in cases of the concrete. As the above instances have shown, on the very many questions we do not give an assent at all. What commonly happens is this, that after hearing and entering into what may be said for a proposition, we pronounce neither for nor against it. We may accept the conclusion as a conclusion dependent on premises, abstract and tending to the concrete, but we do not follow up our inference of a proposition by giving an assent to it. That there are concrete propositions to which we give unconditional assents, I shall presently show, but I am now asking for instances of conditional, for instances in which we assent a little and not much. Usually we do not assent at all. Every day as it comes brings with it opportunities for us to enlarge our circle of assents. We read the newspapers, we look through debates in Parliament, pleadings in the law courts, leading articles, letters of correspondence, reviews of books, criticisms in the fine arts, and we either form no opinion at all upon the subjects discussed as lying out of our line, or at most we have only an opinion about them. At the utmost we say that we are inclined to believe this proposition or that we are not sure it is not true, that much may be said for it, that we have been much struck by it, but we never say that we give it a degree of assent. We might as well talk of degrees of truth as of degrees of assent. Yet Locke heads one of his chapters with the title Degrees of Assent. As a writer of this country who claims our respect from the tone and drift of his work, thus expresses himself after Locke's manner. Moral evidence, he says, may produce a variety of degrees of assents, from suspicion to moral certainty. For here the degree of assent depends upon the degree in which the evidence on one side preponderates or exceeds that on the other. And as this preponderancy may vary almost infinitely, so likewise may the degrees of assent. For a few of these degrees, though but for a few names have been invented. Thus, when the evidence on one side preponderates a very little, there is ground for suspicion or conjecture. Presumption, persuasion, belief, conclusion, conviction, moral certainty, doubt, wavering, distrust, belief are words which imply an increase or decrease of the preponderancy. Some of these words also admit of epithets, which denote a further increase or diminution of assent. And that was all a quote from ever since shortly after Locke's degrees of assent. Can there be a better illustration than this passage supplies of what I have been insisting on above, viz., that in teaching various degrees of assent we tend to destroy assent as an act of the mind altogether? This author makes the degrees of assent infinite, as the degrees of probability are infinite. His assents are really only inferences, and assent is a name without a meaning, the needless repetition of an inference. But in truth, suspicion, conjecture, presumption, persuasion, belief, conclusion, conviction, moral certainty are not assents at all. They are simply more or less strong inferences of the proposition. And doubt, wavering, distrust, belief are recognitions more or less strong of the probability of its contradictory. There is only one sense in which we are allowed to call such acts or states of mind assents. They are opinions, and as such they are, as I have already observed, when speaking of opinion, assents to the plausibility, probability, doubtfulness, or untrustworthiness of a proposition, that is, not variations of assent to an inference, but assents to a variation in inferences. When I assent to a doubtfulness or to a probability, my assent as such is as complete as if I assented to a truth. It is not a certain degree of assent. And in like manner, I may be certain of an uncertainty. That does not destroy the specific notion convened in the word certain. I do not know then when it is that we ever deliberately profess assent to a proposition without meaning to convey to others the impression that we accept it unreservedly, and that because it is true. Certainly we familiarly use such phrases as a half assent, as we also speak of half-truths. But a half assent is not a kind of assent any more than a half truth is a kind of truth. As the object is indivisible, so is the act. A half truth is a proposition which in one aspect is a truth, and in another is not. To give a half assent is to feel drawn towards assent, or to assent one moment and not the next, or to be in the way to assent to it. It means that the proposition in question deserves a hearing, that it is probable or attractive, that it opens important views, that it is a key to perplexing difficulties, or the like. Treating the subject, then, not according to a priori fitness, but according to the facts of human nature, as they are found in the concrete action of life, I find numberless cases in which we do not assent at all, none in which assent is evidently conditional, and many, as I shall now proceed to show, in which it is unconditional, and these in subject matters which admit of nothing higher than probable reasoning. If human nature is to be its own witness, there is no medium between assenting and not assenting. Locke's theory of the duty of assenting more or less according to the degrees of evidence is invalidated by the testimony of high and low, young and old, ancient and modern, as continually given in their ordinary sayings and doings. Indeed, as I have shown, he does not strictly maintain it himself, yet though he feels the claims of nature and fact to be too strong for him in certain cases, he gives no reason why he should violate his theory in these, and yet not in many more. Now let us review some of those assents which men give in evidence short of intuition and demonstration, yet which are as unconditional as if they had the highest evidence. First of all, starting from intuition, of course we all believe without any doubt that we exist, that we have an individuality and identity all our own, that we think, feel, and act in the home of our own minds, that we have a present sense of good and evil, of a right and a wrong, of a true and a false, of a beautiful and a hideous, however we analyze our ideas of them. We have an absolute vision before us of what happened yesterday or last year, so as to be able without any chance of mistake to give evidence upon it in a court of justice, let the consequences be ever so serious. We are sure that of many things we are ignorant, that of many things we are in doubt, and that of many things we are not in doubt. Nor is the assent which we give to facts limited to the range of self-consciousness. We are sure beyond all hazard of a mistake that our own self is not the only being existing, that there is an external world, that it is a system with parts and a universe carried on by laws, and that the future is affected by the past. We accept and hold with an unqualified assent that the earth, considered as a phenomenon, is a globe, that all its regions see the sun by turns, that there are vast tracts on it of land and water, that there are really existing cities on definite sites, which go by the names of London, Paris, Florence, and Madrid. We are sure that Paris or London, unless suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake or burned to the ground, is today just what it was yesterday when we left it. We laugh to scorn the idea that we had no parents, though we had no memory of our birth, that we shall never depart this life, though we can have no experience of the future, that we are able to live without food, though we have never tried, that a world of men did not live before our time, or that the world has had no history, that there has been no rise and fall of states, no great men, no wars, no revolutions, no art, no science, no literature, no religion. We should be either indignant or amused at this report of our intimate friend being false to us, and we are able sometimes, without any hesitation, to accuse certain parties of hostility and injustice to us. We may have a deep consciousness, which we never can lose, that we are on our part having been cruel to others, and that they have felt us to be so, or that we have been felt to be ungenerous to those who love us. We may have an overpowering sense of our moral weakness, of the precariousness of our life, health, wealth, position, and good fortune. We may have a clear view of the weak points of our physical constitution, or of what food or medicine is good for us and what does us harm. We may be able to master, at least in part, the course of our past history, its turning points, our hits, and our great mistakes. We may have a sense of the presence of a supreme being, which never has been dimmed even by a passing shadow, which has inhabited us ever since we can recollect anything, and which we cannot imagine our losing. We may be able, for others have been able, so to realize the precepts and truths of Christianity as deliberately to surrender our life rather than transgress the one or to deny the other. On all these truths we have an immediate and unhesitating hold, nor do we think ourselves guilty of not loving truth for truth's sake, because we cannot reach them through a series of intuitive propositions. Assent on reasonings not demonstrative is too widely recognized an act to be irrational, unless man's nature is irrational, too familiar to the prudent and clear-minded to be an infirmity or an extravagance. None of us can think or act without the acceptance of truths, not intuitive, not demonstrated, yet sovereign. If our nature has any constitution, any laws, one of them is the absolute reception of propositions as true, which lie outside the narrow range of conclusions to which logic, formal or virtual, is tethered, nor has any philosophical theory the power to force on us a rule which will not work for a day.